The boy who would become Merlin was born under a sky that wept silver tears. His mother, Adara, clutched him to her breast as the midwife whispered prayers to the old gods. Outside their humble stone cottage, the village of Caerdu slept unaware that magic had entered the world in the form of a squalling infant with eyes like winter storms. "What shall we call him?" the midwife asked, her weathered hands still trembling from the birth. Adara gazed down at her son, noting how the candlelight seemed to bend toward him, how shadows danced at the edges of the room without wind to move them. "Emrys," she whispered. "His name is Emrys." But names, as the boy would learn, are not always what they seem. 15 years passed in the valley, where mist clung to hillsides like forgotten dreams. Emrys grew tall and lean, with dark hair that caught moonlight and hands that could coax fire from wet wood with nothing but patience and will. The villagers whispered about him, crossing themselves when he passed, but they came to him when their animals fell sick or when storms threatened their crops. His mother had died when he was 12, taking with her the secret of his father's identity. All she left him was a pendant of black stone carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly and words spoken in fever. "Your true name waits in the spaces between heartbeats. When you find it, the world will know your power." Emrys wore the pendant always, feeling its weight against his chest like a second heartbeat. Sometimes, late at night, he thought he could hear it whispering. His magic in those days came like water drawn from a deep well. He would gather herbs under the full moon, speaking words his mother had taught him, combining ritual and will to achieve effects that seemed miraculous to the villagers, but left him drained and aching. When Farmer Hywel's prize bull fell sick with lung fever, Emrys spent 3 days brewing tonics and burning sacred woods, channeling power through complex ceremonies that required precise timing and careful preparation. The bull lived, but Emrys collapsed and slept for 2 days afterward. He knew there were those who could work greater magics with less effort, but he had never understood why until the morning that changed everything. On that dawn, he woke to find his cottage surrounded by soldiers wearing the crimson and gold of King Uther Pendragon. Their captain, a scarred man with eyes like chips of flint, dismounted and approached the door. "You are the boy they call Witch Spawn," the captain said. It was not a question. Emrys stepped outside, barefoot on the frost-covered ground. "I am Emrys, son of Adara. I practice the healing arts. The king has need of your arts." The captain's hand rested on his sword hilt. "There are things stirring in the northern reaches. Dark things. His Majesty's court wizards have failed to divine their nature. And you think I can succeed where they have not?" The captain smiled without warmth. "I think you will try, or this village will burn." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Emrys looked past the soldiers to the faces peering from cottage windows, to old Garrett the blacksmith who had taught him to work metal, to young Mara who brought him herbs in exchange for love charms that never worked. These people had sheltered him, feared him, but accepted him as their own. "I will come," he said. Camelot rose from the mist like a fever dream of white stone and golden banners. Emrys had never seen anything so magnificent or so false. The castle's walls hummed with protective enchantments, but they were crude things, built by wizards who understood the mechanics of magic without comprehending its soul. He could feel their spells pressing against him as he passed through the gates, testing his defenses with the automatic aggression of guard dogs. The magic was powerful but unsubtle, like a hammer where a scalpel was needed. These court wizards had accumulated techniques and formulas, building their power through scholarship and careful ritual, but they missed something essential. They worked magic like scholars translating a foreign language without understanding its poetry. King Uther received him in a hall hung with tapestries depicting great victories. The king was younger than Emrys had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of beauty that came from never knowing hunger or fear. But his eyes held the weight of a crown that grew heavier each day. "So you are the hedge wizard my men dragged from his hovel," Uther said, not bothering to hide his disdain. "I am Emrys of Caerdu, your majesty." The title tasted like ash in his mouth. "My court wizards tell me there are dragons stirring in the Whispering Hills. Not the great beasts of legend, but their smaller, more vicious cousins. They harry my northern settlements, burning fields and taking livestock. Worse, they seem to be growing bolder, as if something drives them toward our lands." Uther leaned forward on his throne. "I am told you have a way with beasts. Tame them for me, and you will be rewarded. Fail, and I will assume you are in league with whatever darkness sends them." The court wizards, a collection of preening men in elaborate robes, snickered among themselves. Emrys felt their magic pressing against him again, testing his defenses, and had to resist the urge to show them what even his borrowed power could accomplish when properly focused. They wielded their spells like clubs, relying on brute force and complex formulae. He had learned to work with subtlety, to find the natural currents of power, and guide them rather than forcing them to his will. "I will need supplies," he said simply, "and a horse." "Done. But know this, boy." Uther's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire hall. "I have little patience for failure. My kingdom faces threats from all sides. I will not tolerate another disappointment." That night, alone in the small chamber they had given him, Emrys sat cross-legged on the stone floor and let his consciousness drift outward. The castle's protective spells were like cobwebs to him, easily pushed aside not through strength, but through understanding their underlying patterns. Beyond the walls, he felt the pulse of the land itself, and within that pulse, a wrongness that made his teeth ache. The dragons were not the true threat. They were fleeing from something far worse. The northern reaches of Uther's kingdom were wild country, where ancient oaks grew in circles that predated human memory, and streams ran silver under starlight. Emrys rode alone, despite the king's offer of soldiers. He understood that some magics could only be approached in solitude. The pendant against his chest grew warm as he traveled deeper into the hills. Sometimes he caught whispers in languages that had been old when the Romans walked these lands. The horse, a steady mare named Gwenliant, grew increasingly nervous, her ears constantly twitching toward sounds only she could hear. On the third day, they found the first dragon. It was smaller than the great worms of legend, perhaps the size of a large dog, with scales that shifted from green to gold to deep purple depending on the light. It lay curled beneath a rowan tree, breathing shallowly, its eyes filmed with pain and exhaustion. Emrys dismounted and approached slowly, his hands open and empty. The dragon's head lifted, and for a moment their eyes met. In those ancient depths, Emrys saw intelligence and desperate fear. "What drives you from your home, little sister?" he whispered. What happened next revealed the fundamental difference between his magic and that of the court wizards. Where they would have needed elaborate rituals to speak with such a creature, requiring hours of preparation and carefully crafted spells of translation, Emrys simply opened his mind and heart to the dragon's pain. The connection formed naturally, like water finding its level. The dragon's mind touched his like a butterfly landing on water. Images flooded through him, a great darkness rising from beneath the earth, tentacles of shadow that choked the light from the sky, and a hunger that devoured magic itself. The dragons were not attacking human settlements out of malice, but fleeing toward any source of protective power they could find. Behind the darkness, pulling at strings like a master puppeteer, was a presence Emrys recognized from his mother's fevered warnings. The unnamed one, the shadow that fell before the first dawn, the hunger that preceded creation. It stirred in the deep places, drawn by the growing concentration of magical power in Uther's kingdom. The dragon died as the sun set, her final breath carrying words in the old tongue. "Beware the one who steals names." That night, as Emrys built his fire in a circle of standing stones that thrummed with ancient power, he finally understood what his mother had tried to tell him. Names were not just words, they were the fundamental essence of being. To know something's true name was to hold power over it absolutely. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the world, something was collecting names like a miser hoarding gold. He pulled out his mother's pendant and held it to the firelight. The carved symbols seemed to move in the dancing shadows, forming patterns that hurt to perceive directly. But gradually, meaning began to emerge. The symbols were not words in any human language. They were instructions, a map written in the grammar of magic itself. They showed him how to look beyond the surface of things, how to see the names that waited in the spaces between heartbeats. Emrys closed his eyes and let his consciousness sink deeper than it had ever gone before, past the surface thoughts of animals and trees, past the slow dreams of stones. into the realm where names lived like living stars. And there, burning with silver fire in the darkness of his soul, he found it. Not Emrys, the name his mother had given him out of love and hope. Not the false names others had called him. Witch spawn, hedge wizard boy. His true name, the word that defined his essential being, rose from the depths of magic like a whale breaching the surface of a dark ocean. Merlin. The name hit him like lightning, rewriting every spell he had ever cast, every piece of magic he had ever touched. The difference was immediate and overwhelming. Where before he had drawn power from herbs and rituals, channeling it through careful ceremonies and borrowed techniques, now magic flowed from his very essence. It was not something he did, but something he was. The standing stones around him began to glow, responding to energies they had not felt for 1,000 years. But more than that, Merlin could suddenly perceive the true structure of reality, the names that held every stone and blade of grass in their proper place. Magic was not about imposing his will upon the world, but about speaking the secret words that the world had always been waiting to hear. He tested this new understanding with a simple gesture, reaching out to heal a withered oak at the edge of the stone circle. Before, such a working would have required hours of preparation, gathering the right herbs, choosing the proper phase of the moon, speaking lengthy incantations to channel power through ritual forms. Now, he simply spoke the tree's true name, the word that defined its essential nature as a living thing, and watched in wonder as new growth spiraled up its trunk like green fire. The tree lived not because he had forced magic into it, but because he had reminded it what it meant to be alive. With the power came understanding, and with understanding came terrible responsibility. He saw now why the unnamed one had stirred from its ancient sleep. The convergence of magical forces around Arthur's birth, for Uther's son would be born within the year, had created ripples that reached even into the deepest places of the earth. Something that had slumbered since the world was young was waking, and it would not sleep again until every trace of true magic had been devoured. When Merlin returned to Camelot, he was no longer the uncertain boy who had left. The guards at the gate stepped aside without being asked, their hands instinctively moving to their sword hilts, even as their eyes slid away from his face. Magic radiated from him like heat from a forge, barely contained and utterly dangerous. But it was different now. Where Emrys had carried power like a burden, constantly aware of its weight and cost, Merlin wore it like his own skin. The court wizards, so dismissive before, now watched him with expressions that mixed fear and desperate curiosity. They could sense that he had crossed some fundamental threshold, moved beyond their understanding of what magic could be. King Uther received him in private this time, in a small chamber where tapestries could not hide the concern in his eyes. "The dragons?" the king asked. "Are the least of your problems," Merlin replied. His voice carried harmonics that had not been there before, echoes of the true name that now defined him. "There is something rising in the deep places, something that feeds on magic itself. The dragons were fleeing from it, seeking any source of protective power they could find. And can you stop it?" Merlin was silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of futures pressing down on him. He could see the threads of possibility spreading out from this moment like a vast web. In some futures, he told Uther everything and watched the kingdom tear itself apart in panic. In others, he said nothing and watched darkness swallow the world one name at a time. "Not alone," he said finally, "and not as I am now. What do you need? Time. And your trust, though I know I have not earned it." Uther studied him with the calculating gaze of a man who had survived 20 years of kingship through careful judgment of character. "You are different. When you left, you were a boy playing with powers he did not understand. Now—" he paused, searching for words. "Now you are something else entirely." "I found my true name," Merlin said simply, "and with it, the responsibility to use its power wisely." "Merlin." The king spoke the name like he was tasting wine, testing its flavor. "Yes, I can see why the old name no longer fits." "Very well, Merlin. You have my trust for now. But know that trust, once broken, cannot be mended. In the months that followed, Merlin worked to prepare the kingdom for what was coming. He could not speak openly of the threat, for panic would only feed the darkness that stirred beneath the world. Instead, he began to weave protections into the very stones of Camelot, enchantments so subtle that even the court wizards failed to notice them. These new protections were unlike anything he could have created as Emrys. Where his old magic had required complex rituals and external components, his true name power allowed him to speak directly to the essential nature of stone and mortar, convincing them to remember their purpose as barriers against harm. The walls did not simply hold defensive spells, they became defensive spells, their very existence a ward against the forces that sought to unmake the world. He also began to watch Queen Igraine with the intensity of a man waiting for lightning to strike. The child she carried would be crucial to the coming battle, though not in the way the prophecies suggested. Arthur would not defeat the unnamed one through strength of arms or purity of heart. He would do it by becoming something new, a bridge between the magic of the old world and the rationality of the new. But first, the child had to survive to be born. During these months, Merlin also began to understand the court wizards' resentment more clearly. They were not evil men, merely practitioners who had spent decades accumulating power through study and careful ritual, only to watch a young hedge wizard surpass them all by finding a single word. Their leader, a sharp-faced man named Mordred who had served Uther faithfully for 15 years, was particularly bitter. "Tell me, young Merlin," Mordred said one evening as they walked through the castle's herb garden, "what makes your magic so superior to ours? We have studied the ancient texts, mastered the celestial correspondences, learned to channel the very forces of creation, yet you accomplish with a gesture what takes us hours of preparation." Merlin paused beside a bed of moonflowers, their white petals glowing softly in the twilight. "You work with magic as if it were a foreign language," he said finally, "learning its grammar, memorizing its vocabulary, following its rules. But you never learn to think in that language." "And you do?" "I don't think in it. I am it." Merlin touched one of the moonflowers, and it began to sing, a sound like silver bells carried on wind. "You gather power from outside yourselves, and shape it through will and knowledge. I speak from the place where power originates." Mordred's eyes narrowed. "And where might that be?" "The truth of what you are. Your name, spoken in the language that existed before words." It was the wrong thing to say. Merlin saw the moment when philosophical curiosity transformed into something darker. In Mordred's expression, he glimpsed a hunger that had nothing to do with magical power and everything to do with control over the forces that made control impossible. The attack came on the winter solstice, when the barriers between worlds grew thin. Merlin felt it first as a pressure behind his eyes, then as a wrongness in the air that made his skin crawl. The court wizards collapsed one by one, their borrowed power no match for the psychic assault that preceded the unnamed one's servants. They came not as armies or monsters, but as a creeping wrongness that drained names from everything it touched. A soldier would stand guard one moment, and the next be a hollow shell, with no memory of who he had been. A horse would become a four-legged thing that breathed and ate, but had forgotten how to be a horse. Merlin met them at Camelot's gates, his true name blazing around him like armor made of starlight. The difference between his power and what he had wielded as Emrys was never more apparent. Where the hedge wizard would have needed rituals and tools calling upon external forces through careful ceremony, Merlin simply spoke reality into a new shape. The first wave of shadow servants struck his defenses and recoiled as if they had touched molten gold. But they did not flee. Instead, they began to circle, probing for weaknesses in his protections. "You cannot protect them all, little wizard," a voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. "Every name you guard is one less piece of yourself you can preserve. How long before you forget your own true word?" The battle was not fought with swords or fire, but with the fundamental forces that held reality together. Merlin spoke words of binding and protection, while the servants of darkness whispered songs of unmaking. Names hung in the air between them like bright sparks, each one a life or identity that could be snuffed out with a careless word. As the night wore on, Merlin began to understand the true scope of the threat. The Unnamed One was not simply trying to destroy Camelot's defenders. It was teaching its servants to steal and hoard the essence of identity itself. Every name they consumed made them stronger, more real, while their victims faded into forgettable shadows. The battle turned when Merlin stopped trying to fight the shadow servants directly and instead began to speak the true names of everyone they had touched. A guard who had forgotten his identity as Thomas the Bold remembered himself when Merlin called him by the name that defined his courage. A horse that had become merely animal recalled its nature as Swiftwind when its essential name rang out across the courtyard. As dawn broke, Merlin stood alone among the dissolving servants of shadow. But victory had come at a cost he was only beginning to understand. Each name he had saved had required him to spend a piece of his own power, and his true name now burned with a dimmer light. The Unnamed One had not been defeated, merely driven back. And next time, it would come prepared for the wizard who had learned to speak his own name. Arthur was born 3 months later, under a sky filled with falling stars. Merlin held the infant prince in his arms and saw not just a future king, but a focal point around which the scattered magics of the world could gather and grow strong. The child would not be a wizard in the traditional sense, but he would be something more valuable, a catalyst for change. In the days that followed the birth, as Uther celebrated the continuation of his line, Merlin made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He could not defeat the Unnamed One through direct confrontation. The entity was too old, too hungry, too willing to devour entire kingdoms to feed its endless appetite for names and identity. But he could prepare the world for a different kind of battle. Working in secret, Merlin began to weave protective enchantments around the infant Arthur, but not the kind of crude shields that the court wizards might have crafted. Instead, he spoke to the essential nature of the child's developing identity, strengthening the connection between Arthur's growing sense of self and the deepest currents of magic that flowed through the world. As the boy grew, he would naturally draw magical practitioners to him not through any conscious effort, but because his very presence would make their power stronger and more focused. Arthur would become a living nexus, a point where individual magics could connect and reinforce each other. Over the years that followed, Merlin carefully shaped events to ensure Arthur's survival and growth. He arranged for the boy to be fostered away from court, where he could learn humility and strength without the corruption of absolute power. He planted seeds of stories and songs that would make Arthur's eventual return seem like destiny fulfilled rather than political maneuvering. But most importantly, he began to teach others what he had learned about the nature of true names. It started with the castle's servants, those invisible people who kept the kingdom running while nobles played their games of power. To Meredith, the kitchen maid, who had always been able to soothe crying babies with a touch, Merlin whispered hints about the name that waited in her heart. To Gareth, the stable master, whose horses never fell lame or lost their way, he spoke of the word that connected him to all creatures that run and leap and fly. None of them underwent the dramatic transformation that had marked his own discovery of his true name. But each began to understand that their small magics were not accidents or tricks, but expressions of something fundamental about who they were. And always, in the back of his mind, Merlin prepared for the day when the Unnamed One would return. The corruption began subtly, as corruption always does. Mordred, the sharp-faced court wizard who had never quite forgiven Merlin his rapid rise to power, began to ask different kinds of questions. Not about the mechanics of magic or the proper timing of rituals, but about the nature of order itself. "Consider this," Mordred said one evening as they stood in the castle's observatory, watching stars wheel across the sky. "Every great civilization in history has fallen when magic grew too widespread. Egypt, Greece, Atlantis, if the legends are true. Why do you suppose that is?" Merlin kept his eyes on the constellations, feeling the wrongness in his companion's words like a splinter under the skin. Perhaps because their magic was built on domination rather than understanding. Or perhaps because magic itself is chaos, and chaos inevitably destroys order. Mordred moved to stand beside him, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who had thought deeply about these matters. "Look at what happened during the solstice attack. Your power protected the castle, yes, But at what cost? How many guards still wake screaming from dreams they cannot remember? How many servants jump at shadows because some part of them recalls being unmade? It was true, and Merlin knew it. The battle with the shadow servants had left scars that went deeper than memory. Even victory over such forces carried a price. "What do you propose?" Merlin asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Gradual limitation, careful regulation. Magic is a tool, like fire or steel, and like any tool, it should be controlled by those wise enough to understand its proper use. Mordred's words carried the ring of absolute conviction. We could create a new order, one where magical power serves the kingdom rather than threatening it. No more hedge wizards working unsupervised in remote villages. No more untrained practitioners stumbling into forces they cannot comprehend. Everything organized, everything controlled, everything safe. Merlin finally turned to look at his colleague, seeing in Mordred's eyes a light that had nothing to do with wisdom and everything to do with the hunger for certainty in an uncertain world. And who would do this controlling? Those who have proven themselves capable, of course. The court wizards, properly organized and granted authority to regulate magical practice throughout the kingdom. Mordred smiled, and it was the smile of a man who believed himself to be saving the world. Think of it, Merlin. No more children born with powers they cannot understand or control. No more villages terrorized by practitioners who mistake their small abilities for great wisdom. Order, peace, safety. In that moment, Merlin understood what was happening. The Unnamed One had not been defeated in their earlier battle. It had simply changed tactics, choosing corruption over conquest, whispering not to the desperate and power-hungry, but to those who genuinely believed they were protecting others from the chaos of uncontrolled magic. "And what of those who refuse this new order?" Merlin asked. Mordred's smile never wavered. "Then they will be educated in the error of their ways. Or, if education proves insufficient, they will be prevented from causing harm to others." The purges began a year later, after Arthur's 5th birthday had passed in celebration and hope. They did not call them purges, of course. Mordred had grown too sophisticated for such crude language. Instead, they were magical assessments designed to ensure that practitioners throughout the kingdom were working within established safety parameters. Teams of court wizards, armed with writs bearing Uther's seal, traveled from village to village. They tested local healers and wise women, evaluating their abilities against standards that seemed to change with each assessment. Those who passed were granted licenses to continue their practice under strict supervision. Those who failed were given a choice: abandon their magic entirely or face charges of endangering the public welfare. Many chose abandonment. It was easier than fighting, safer than resistance. They returned to purely mundane lives, using herbs without speaking to their spirits, setting bones without calling upon the deep currents of healing that had always guided their hands. The magic did not disappear entirely, but it dimmed, became uncertain, lost the connection to essential truth that had made it effective. Others refused to abandon what they saw as fundamental to their nature. These were brought to Camelot for intensive re-education, a process that involved systematic attempts to sever their connection to their magical abilities. The court wizards had developed techniques for this, carefully crafted spells that could block a practitioner's access to power without technically harming them. Merlin watched it all with growing horror, understanding at last the true genius of the Unnamed One's strategy. It did not need to destroy magic directly. It only needed to convince well-meaning people that magic itself was the problem, that safety lay in controlling and limiting the very forces that made resistance possible. He tried to intervene, speaking privately with Uther about the dangers of Mordred's approach, but the king had seen the stability that the new order brought, the way it eliminated the unpredictable incidents that had always plagued his reign. Villages no longer lived in fear of hedge wizards whose experiments might go wrong. Court politics had become simpler, without the wild card of independent magical practitioners. "You speak as if order were a bad thing," Uther said when Merlin pressed the matter. "But I have seen what chaos looks like. I remember the shadow servants, the way they unmade my people's very identities. If controlling magic prevents such horrors from returning, then control we must." "And when the next great threat comes, what will defend us?" Merlin asked. Court wizards who follow formulas and regulations? Practitioners who have forgotten how to listen to the deep currents of power? We will have you, Uther replied with simple confidence. You are worth a dozen lesser wizards. It was then that Merlin realized the full scope of his failure. In becoming so powerful, so far beyond what ordinary practitioners could achieve, he had made himself both indispensable and irrelevant. Indispensable because his abilities were clearly superior to anyone else's. Irrelevant because his very existence made it seem unnecessary to preserve the broader magical traditions that had always protected the kingdom. He was a tower of strength, surrounded by a field of growing weakness, and when he fell, there would be nothing left to catch him. Arthur returned to Camelot on his 20th birthday, no longer the boy who had been fostered in distant lands, but a man who moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to lead through service rather than command. Merlin watched from the shadows as Uther's son walked through the great hall, noting how conversations ceased, not from fear, but from a kind of magnetic attention that drew people's focus, like iron filings to a lodestone. The enchantments Merlin had woven around Arthur as an infant had taken root and grown, but not in ways anyone could have predicted. The boy had not developed obvious magical abilities. Instead, he had become something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. A natural catalyst who made everyone around him more than they had been before. Knights found their courage burning brighter in his presence. Servants discovered reserves of wisdom they had never known they possessed. Even hardened court politicians found themselves speaking more honestly when Arthur was in the room, as if his very existence made deception seem petty and unnecessary. But the most significant change was in how he affected magical practitioners. The few who remained in Camelot after Mordred's purges found their abilities strengthened when Arthur was near, their connection to the deep currents of power clarified and amplified. It was as if he provided a kind of resonance that made their individual magic sing in harmony rather than competing for limited resources. Mordred noticed this immediately, and his reaction was everything Merlin had feared it would be. The boy is dangerous, Mordred said during a private meeting with the senior court wizards. His very presence destabilizes our carefully constructed order. Magic grows wild around him, unpredictable, beyond our ability to regulate or control. He is the king's son, protested Gaius, an elderly wizard who had served the court faithfully for 40 years. Surely his abilities are a gift to be celebrated, not a threat to be contained. Tell me, Gaius, Mordred replied with silky reasonableness. What happens to our authority when every hedge wizard and village healer claims they cannot be regulated because the prince's presence changes their abilities? What becomes of public safety when practitioners argue that Arthur's influence makes their dangerous experiments somehow safe? The other wizards murmured agreement. They had built their careers on the premise that magic required careful control and expert oversight. Arthur's natural ability to amplify and harmonize magical abilities threatened the very foundation of their professional identity. Over the following months, Mordred began a careful campaign to document the dangerous instabilities that Arthur's presence caused in magical workings. Every spell that performed differently when the prince was nearby was recorded as evidence of his disruptive influence. Every practitioner who found their abilities enhanced was cited as proof that proper regulatory oversight was being undermined. It was masterfully done, using the court wizard's own desire for order and control to build a case against the one person who might have united the kingdom's scattered magical traditions into something capable of resisting the deeper darkness that still stirred in the world's hidden places. The confrontation came during Arthur's 25th birthday celebration, as the kingdom celebrated the prince who had brought a strange new stability to Uther's reign. Merlin stood at the edge of the great hall, watching nobles and commoners alike bend naturally toward Arthur's presence, like flowers turning toward the sun. But he also saw the trap closing around them all. Mordred approached through the crowd, his face set in lines of regretful determination. Behind him came a cadre of court wizards, and several of Uther's most trusted advisors, all wearing expressions that suggested they were about to perform an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Your Majesty," Mordred said, his voice cutting through the celebration like a blade, "we must speak of urgent matters that can no longer be ignored." The music stopped. Conversations died. Arthur himself turned to face the court wizard, and Merlin saw something shift in the prince's expression, a recognition of the moment when easy times come to an end. "Speak then," Uther commanded, though his tone suggested he already knew he would not like what he heard. "Your son's magical influence has grown beyond what can be safely contained," Mordred announced, his words carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall. "His very presence disrupts the careful balance we have worked to establish, making magical regulation impossible and endangering the stability of the kingdom." The accusation hung in the air like poisoned smoke. Merlin felt the weight of destiny settling around them all, the sense that everything they had built together was about to collapse under the pressure of fears that had been carefully nurtured and expertly manipulated. "What do you propose?" Uther asked, and Merlin heard in the king's voice the exhaustion of a man who had spent too many years making impossible choices. "Limitation. For the good of the kingdom and the prince himself, his magical influence must be contained. We have developed procedures that will allow him to live a normal life while preventing his abilities from destabilizing our carefully constructed order." Arthur stepped forward, and Merlin saw in that movement the same natural authority that had drawn people to him since childhood. But now it was focused and deliberate, the power of a man who had finally understood what he was being called to do. "And if I refuse this limitation?" Arthur asked. Mordred's smile was genuinely regretful. "Then you will be choosing chaos over order, magic over law, your personal desires over the good of your father's kingdom. Surely the prince who has served so faithfully would not wish to be remembered as the one who brought destruction to all he holds dear." It was perfectly crafted manipulation, using Arthur's own nobility against him. "Accept the limitation and lose the ability to serve as a focus for the kingdom's scattered magical traditions. Refuse and be branded as a selfish threat to public safety." In the silence that followed, Merlin finally understood what he had to do. "There is another way," Merlin said, stepping forward from the shadows where he had watched events unfold. Every eye in the hall turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Court wizards who had resented his power, nobles who had never quite trusted his influence, servants who had looked to him for protection they could not find elsewhere. All of them waiting to see what the great wizard Merlin would do in this moment of crisis. "The problem," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "is not that Arthur's influence makes magic stronger. The problem is that we have spent so many years weakening magic that his natural abilities seem dangerous by comparison." Mordred's eyes narrowed. "You would have us return to the chaos of unregulated practice? Forget the lessons we learned during the Shadow Servant attack?" "I would have us remember different lessons," Merlin replied. "That strength shared is strength multiplied. That magic controlled by fear becomes magic too weak to protect what matters. That the greatest threat to this kingdom is not chaos, but the kind of rigid order that leaves us defenseless when true darkness returns." He turned to face the assembled crowd, speaking not just to the nobles and courtiers, but to every person in the hall who had ever felt the touch of magic in their lives. "Mordred speaks of regulation and control, but what he truly offers is the slow strangulation of the very forces that have always protected this land. He would have you believe that safety lies in limitation, that power diminishes when it is shared. But I have learned the secret that the unnamed one fears most of all." "And what secret is that?" Uther asked, his voice carefully neutral. Merlin reached up and grasped the pendant that had hung around his neck since childhood. The black stone carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. With a sharp motion, he pulled it free and held it high so that everyone in the hall could see it. "The secret that names grow stronger when they are spoken aloud, not weaker. That true power comes not from hoarding magical abilities, but from teaching others to find their own." The pendant began to glow with silver light, and Merlin felt the familiar weight of his true name burning in his chest like a star. But instead of holding that power close, instead of using it to dominate or intimidate, he opened his heart and let it flow outward. "My name is Merlin," he said, and the words carried harmonics that resonated in the stones of the castle itself. "But that name means nothing if it stands alone. Watch and understand what magic truly is." He spoke his true name again, but this time he spoke it as an invitation rather than a declaration. The silver light spread from the pendant to touch everyone in the hall, and in that light, People began to remember things they had forgotten or never known they possessed. A serving girl named Bronwyn felt the word that connected her to the growing things of the earth, the name that explained why plants always thrived under her care. Sir Gareth, one of Arthur's knights, heard the name that had always made his sword arm stronger and his courage steadier in battle. Even some of the court wizards, those who had begun their training with genuine desire to help others, felt the stirring of names they had buried under years of formulas and regulations. But the most dramatic change came in Arthur himself. As Merlin's true name resonated through the hall, the prince's natural abilities crystallized into something magnificent and terrible. Not a name in the way others experienced it, but a living embodiment of connection itself, a force that drew every individual spark of magic into a greater harmony. "This is what the unnamed one truly fears," Merlin said as the silver light continued to spread. "Not any individual wizard or magical working, but the possibility that we might remember how to sing together instead of standing alone." Mordred stumbled backward, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. "You fool! You'll destroy everything we've built. Magic without control is chaos. Power without regulation is destruction. Power without authenticity is weakness," Merlin replied. "And we have been weak too long." The court wizard raised his hands, preparing to cast some working that would contain or counter what Merlin had unleashed. But the spell died on his lips as he realized that the old rules no longer applied. Half the people in the hall were now connected to sources of power that his carefully constructed theories could not explain or contain. "Stop this," Mordred demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're endangering the kingdom." "I am saving it," Merlin said simply, though not in the way any of us expected. What happened next would be debated by scholars for centuries to come. Some claimed that Merlin cast the greatest spell in history, a working that fundamentally altered the nature of magic itself. Others insisted that he had simply revealed what had always been true, stripping away the illusions that had hidden the deeper connections between all living things. But those who were present in the hall that night knew that the truth was both simpler and more profound than either explanation suggested. Merlin had chosen to give away the very thing that made him unique, sharing his true name not as words to be repeated, but as a pattern to be understood and adapted. The silver light that had begun with his pendant spread through the hall, like water flowing into every available space. But instead of overwhelming those it touched, it seemed to awaken something that had always been there, waiting for permission to emerge. People began to understand that their small abilities, their intuitive connections to the world around them, were not accidents or tricks but fragments of a larger truth. The kitchen maid who could soothe crying babies was touching the name that connected all mothers to their children. The stable master whose horses never lost their way was speaking the word that linked all creatures who run and leap and fly. Even those without obvious magical talents found themselves connected to the growing web of shared understanding. A scribe discovered that his careful attention to detail was its own form of magic, a way of preserving truth against the erosion of time and forgetfulness. A guard realized that his dedication to protecting others was itself a magical working, a spell of standing between danger and those too weak to defend themselves. Arthur stood at the center of it all, no longer just a catalyst for individual abilities, but a living nexus that helped disparate magics find harmony with each other. Knights and servants, nobles and commoners, all found their various gifts enhanced and clarified by connection to the growing network of shared power. But the most profound change was in how they understood themselves. Where before each person had been an isolated individual struggling to make sense of their place in the world, now they were part of something larger and more enduring. Not absorbed or diminished, but connected in ways that made their individual natures more real rather than less. Mordred watched it all with growing horror, understanding at last what was happening. "You've doomed us all," he whispered. "The unnamed one feeds on chaos, and you've just given it more than it could have dreamed of devouring." "The unnamed one feeds on isolation," Merlin corrected. "On the fear that makes people hoard their true selves instead of sharing them. What we have created here is its opposite. A community where individual identity grows stronger through connection rather than weaker." As if summoned by their conversation, a new presence made itself felt in the hall. Not the creeping wrongness of shadow servants or the overt malevolence of magical attack, but something subtler and more insidious. The Unnamed One had arrived not as conqueror, but as observer, drawn by the massive release of magical energy that had just taken place. So, a voice whispered in minds throughout the hall, the little wizard thinks he has found a new way to play the game. But names shared are names weakened, and weakened names can be taken more easily than strong ones. You have given me not one great prize, but dozens of smaller ones. The temperature in the hall dropped by 20 degrees. Frost began to form on the windows, and people's breath misted an air that suddenly carried the chill of deep winter. But instead of the panic that such manifestations had always caused before, Merlin felt something else from the assembled crowd: determination. They were no longer isolated individuals facing an incomprehensible threat. They were a community, and communities had their own forms of strength. "You are wrong," Arthur said, stepping forward to stand beside Merlin. His voice carried the authority of kingship, but also something deeper, the confidence of someone who had finally understood his true purpose. Names shared are not names weakened. They are names that remember what they were always meant to be. The presence of the Unnamed One pressed against their minds like a vast weight, trying to convince them that identity was a zero-sum game where one person's strength necessarily diminished another's. But the network of connections that Merlin had awakened held firm, each person's sense of self reinforced by their links to others rather than threatened by them. "Impossible," the voice hissed. "I have devoured the names of gods and heroes, absorbed the identities of entire civilizations. You are nothing but mortals, playing with forces beyond your comprehension." "Perhaps," Merlin agreed, "but we are mortals who have learned to play together." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. There were no flashy displays of magical power, no dramatic confrontations between opposing forces. Instead, there was something far more profound: a fundamental disagreement about the nature of identity itself. The Unnamed One had spent eons convincing people that strength came from protecting their essential selves, that sharing their true names with others would diminish them until nothing remained. It was the philosophy of scarcity applied to the deepest levels of human existence, the belief that there was only so much identity to go around and that preserving your own required taking from others. But the community that had formed in Camelot's Great Hall operated on entirely different principles. Each person who spoke their true name aloud found it growing stronger rather than weaker. Each connection formed between individuals created new possibilities rather than limiting existing ones. A blacksmith's understanding of his craft deepened when he shared it with a farmer's knowledge of growing things. A healer's abilities expanded when they learned to work in harmony with a knight's protective instincts. Magic flowed between them like water finding its level, but instead of equalizing at some lower common denominator, it lifted everyone toward greater heights. The Unnamed One pressed harder, trying to break the connections that bound the community together. It whispered to individuals about the dangers of vulnerability, the foolishness of trusting others with their deepest truths. But its arguments found no purchase because the people in the hall were no longer operating from fear. They had discovered what Merlin had suspected, but never dared to prove: that the deepest magic comes not from hoarding power, but from sharing it so completely that the distinction between self and other begins to break down. Not in the sense of losing individual identity, but in the sense of discovering that individual identity is enriched, rather than threatened by genuine connection to others. "This is not possible," the Unnamed One raged, its voice losing the silky confidence it had always carried. "Names are meant to be possessed, controlled, consumed. That is the natural order. That is how power works." "Then perhaps," Arthur said with quiet certainty, "it is time for a new understanding of power." The moment of transformation came when Merlin made his final choice. He could feel the Unnamed One's presence like ice in his veins, could sense its desperate hunger for the network of names and identities that had formed around Arthur's natural abilities. The entity was weakening, its fundamental assumptions about reality proven wrong, but it was not yet defeated. Destroying it would require more than just proving it wrong. It would require demonstrating so completely the power of shared identity that the very concept of hoarding names would become impossible to sustain. Merlin had given away pieces of his true name to create the initial connections that bound the community together. Now he made the choice to give away the rest. "Merlin," he said, speaking his name not as a word of power but as a gift offered freely to everyone present. "Take it, use it, make it part of who you are, but do not let it replace who you are. Let it be the bridge that connects your truth to the truth of others." The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Instead of his name being diminished by division, it became something larger and more complex. Every person who accepted his gift found their own identity expanded rather than replaced, their individual nature enhanced by connection to the pattern of wisdom and protection that the name Merlin represented. The blacksmith remained himself, but gained access to understanding that went beyond craft into the realm of shaping reality itself. The healer continued to work with herbs and poultices, but now understood how to speak to the essential nature of health and wholeness. Even the servants and guards found themselves capable of small miracles, their ordinary duties transformed into acts of magic by their connection to the deeper currents of power. Arthur stood at the center of it all, no longer just a catalyst, but a living embodiment of the principle that individual excellence and community strength were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same truth. Through him, the scattered fragments of Merlin's name found harmony, creating something that was greater than the sum of its parts while remaining true to each individual contribution. The Unnamed One made one final attempt to reassert its dominance, reaching out with tendrils of shadow to drain the names from those who had dared to share them. But it found nothing to grasp. The identities it sought to devour were no longer discrete entities that could be isolated and consumed. They had become part of a living network, each name reinforced by its connections to all the others. "This cannot be," it whispered, its voice already beginning to fade. "Without separation, there is no identity. Without ownership, there is no power. Without fear, there is no control. Without isolation, there is no hunger." Merlin replied, though his voice now came from dozens of throats speaking in harmony, rather than from his alone. "Without scarcity, there is no need to devour. Without fear, there is no reason to hide in the spaces between worlds." The Unnamed One's presence began to dissolve, not destroyed, but transformed. Its vast hunger, fed for so long on stolen identities and hoarded power, gradually gave way to something that might have been peace. For the first time in eons beyond counting, it experienced the possibility of being something other than empty need. As the entity faded from the hall, taking with it the supernatural cold and the whispers of doubt and division, those present realized they had witnessed something unprecedented in the history of magic. Not the defeat of darkness by light, but the transformation of hunger into fulfillment, of isolation into connection, of fear into love. In the days that followed, word of what had happened at Camelot spread throughout the kingdom and beyond. Some called it the greatest magical working in history. Others insisted it was a new form of madness that threatened the natural order of things. But those who had been present knew that it was something simpler and more profound than either explanation could capture. They had discovered that the deepest magic was not about controlling external forces, but about becoming authentically themselves in community with others. The network of shared names and identities that had formed around Arthur continued to grow, drawing in people from every corner of the kingdom who had always sensed that there was more to life than the narrow roles they had been assigned. Mordred, faced with the collapse of everything he had worked to build, made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of fleeing or fighting the new order, he approached Arthur with an expression that mixed defeat with something that might have been relief. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought control was safety, but I see now that it was just fear wearing a mask. If there is a place for me in this new world you are building, I would like to learn what I should have understood from the beginning." Arthur's response revealed the depth of his transformation from prince to true king. There is a place for everyone who chooses connection over isolation, growth over stagnation, truth over the comfortable lies we tell ourselves. But the choice must be genuine, made from understanding rather than desperation. Over the months that followed, Mordred proved the sincerity of his conversion. He became one of the most effective teachers in the new system that Arthur established, helping former practitioners of controlled magic learn to work with the deeper currents of power that flowed through the expanded community. His intimate knowledge of the old ways made him uniquely qualified to help others break free from the limitations they had imposed on themselves. The kingdom itself began to change in ways that went far beyond magic. With so many people connected to their authentic identities and to each other, problems that had seemed intractable began to find solutions. Disputes between villages were resolved through genuine understanding rather than imposed authority. Trade flourished as people discovered that their individual excellences were enhanced rather than threatened by the success of others. Even the land itself seemed to respond to the new harmony among its inhabitants. Crops grew more abundant, wild animals became less fearful of human contact, and the weather patterns that had been increasingly erratic in recent years stabilized into cycles that supported rather than threatened human endeavors. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people understood the relationship between individual identity and community belonging. The old assumption that you had to choose between being authentically yourself and fitting in with others proved to be false. In the network of shared names and identities that had grown from Merlin's sacrifice, individual uniqueness and community harmony reinforced each other rather than competing. Arthur ruled for 40 years, presiding over an age that historians would later call the flowering of the authentic kingdom. But his greatest achievement was not any single policy or conquest, but the way he managed to institutionalize the principles that had emerged from that night in Camelot's great hall. The Round Table he established was not just a council of knights, but a living symbol of how individual excellence could serve collective good without losing its essential nature. Each knight brought their own unique gifts and perspectives to the group, but found those gifts magnified and clarified by their connection to the others. Sir Lancelot's unmatched skill in combat was enhanced by Sir Gareth's strategic wisdom, which in turn was strengthened by Sir Percival's intuitive understanding of human nature. The code they followed was simple in concept but revolutionary in practice. Serve the truth of who you are in service to the truth of what we might become together. It avoided both the chaos of pure individualism and the stagnation of enforced conformity, creating a dynamic balance that could adapt to new challenges while maintaining its essential character. Magic, meanwhile, flourished throughout the kingdom in ways that would have been impossible under the old system of regulation and control. Instead of a few highly trained specialists hoarding arcane knowledge, there emerged a rich ecosystem of practitioners working at every level of society. Village healers learned to enhance their skills by drawing on the network of shared understanding that connected them to court physicians and traveling herbalists. Blacksmiths discovered that their work with metal could become a form of collaboration with the essential nature of iron and steel. Even ordinary farmers found that their connection to the growing things of the earth could transform agriculture from mere labor into a form of active partnership with the land. The court wizards, initially resistant to changes that seemed to threaten their professional status, gradually discovered that their specialized knowledge became more valuable, rather than less in the new system. Instead of competing for limited resources and jealously guarding their secrets, they found themselves teaching and learning in a continuous exchange that elevated everyone involved. But Merlin himself, having given away his individual identity to create the possibility of collective transformation, became something unprecedented in the history of magic. No longer a single person wielding great power, he had become a living principle that existed wherever people chose authentic connection over protective isolation. Sometimes he appeared as an elderly man offering cryptic advice to those facing difficult choices. Sometimes he manifested as a subtle influence that helped people discover their true names and learn to speak them without fear. Most often, he was simply a presence that people felt when they opened their hearts to the possibility that individual identity and community belonging could reinforce rather than threaten each other. Those who knew him in his original form sometimes mourned the loss of the great wizard, who had once walked among them as a specific person with recognizable features and predictable habits. But they gradually came to understand that what he had become was more enduring and ultimately more powerful than what he had been. The pattern of wisdom and connection that bore his name could adapt to any situation, speak any language, appear in any form that was needed to help people remember their authentic selves and their connections to others. On the night before Arthur's death, as the king lay peacefully in his bed surrounded by those who had shared his long journey toward a more authentic way of being, Merlin appeared one last time in something approaching his original form. Not the powerful wizard who had once commanded dragons and battled shadow servants, but an old man with kind eyes and hands that still remembered the weight of magic. "Was it worth it?" Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The sacrifice you made, the identity you gave away to save us all?" Merlin smiled, and in that expression was all the wisdom of someone who had learned the deepest secret of existence. "I thought I was giving something away," he said, "but I discovered that the only way to truly possess your name is to share it so completely that it becomes part of the fabric of the world itself." "And the kingdom? Will it survive without your direct guidance?" "The kingdom will survive because it no longer needs my direct guidance. The pattern we established here will spread like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever people are ready to remember that individual authenticity and community belonging are not opposing forces but complementary aspects of the same truth." Arthur nodded, understanding at last why Merlin had always seemed both present and absent, both essential and unnecessary. "You became the story instead of just living in it." "I became the possibility," Merlin corrected gently. "The story writes itself anew in every generation, in every heart that learns to speak its true name without fear." As dawn broke over Camelot, painting the white stones gold and red, Arthur passed peacefully into whatever realm awaits those who have fulfilled their deepest purpose. The kingdom mourned him, but they did not despair, for they had learned that true leadership is not about one person holding power, but about creating conditions where everyone can discover and express their authentic selves in service to the common good. The Round Table was retired, but the principles it represented lived on in countless new forms. Knights and farmers, healers and craftsmen, nobles and commoners continued to gather in circles where individual excellence served collective wisdom, and collective wisdom enhanced individual growth. And in every such gathering, whether it was acknowledged or not, the presence that had once been called Merlin continued to offer the same gift he had always given, the reminder that the greatest magic of all is the courage to become fully, fearlessly, authentically yourself in connection with others who are doing the same. The unnamed one never returned, for it had learned that there was no longer any hunger for it to feed upon. In a world where names were shared rather than hoarded, where identity was strengthened by connection rather than threatened by it, the very concept of devouring others' essential selves had become meaningless. But sometimes, in the deep places where shadows gather and old hungers stir, something that might have been the unnamed one remembered what it felt like to be transformed from emptiness into fullness, from isolation into connection. And in those moments it added its own quiet voice to the growing chorus of those who had learned that the only way to truly possess power is to share it so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from love.